Hey.
What's going on?
How the heck are you?
I'm hanging in there. It's
All right.
Monday.
Well, thank you, Rick. Um, I'm glad that you're here. Um, I'm Richard Graves, and this is Rick Lockhart. Rick is stepping in for my illustrious co-host, Cynthia, who's not here this week.
Can we redo that?
Yeah, we can redo it
that intro.
We can redo the intro because I sure messed it up. I was like in the middle of.
It was just dead silence. All right, here we go. Are you both ready?
We're
Take
ready.
two.
Take two. Welcome to the 13%. I'm your host, Richard Graves, with my co-host, Rick Lockhart, who is sitting in tonight for the illustrious Cynthia McDonald, my normal adult counterpart who keeps me in control. So Rick, unfortunately, has inherited the responsibility of keeping me on point with my adult ADD and all that stuff. So thank you, Rick, for being willing to take it for the team.
Hey, listen, it's part of the YFNA News family. I'm happy to be here. It is an honor. And for those of you who are watching, please make sure that you like this video, subscribe to the YFNA News channel, and be sure to click the little bell for the alerts so that you can get all of the updates of when our shows go live. Richard, I'm happy to be here to hang out with you. And this is it's such an honor, man. It really is. It's part of what we do when we get a chance to step in for each other. So we got a great topic tonight too to discuss with you.
Thank you. And I appreciate, by the way, I just want to mention your show, in Black and White, the show that you do with Ethan. And I watched yesterday, and it was an excellent show. You guys did excellent in communicating. I was actually watching the whole time, as you are well aware.
Well, we had the privilege and pleasure of having your co-host, your normal co-host, Cynthia McDonald, join us in that conversation. And hats off to her, hoping that she's doing okay. But hey, it's a family affair. You can definitely check out In Black and White on YFNA News on Thursday nights here at 7:30. Again, if you click that little alert button at the YFNA News channel, you'll make sure to get the alerts of when the 13% goes live, as well as In Black and White.
Absolutely. I'm thankful for everyone looking and watching us tonight. We're going to talk about a subject. As we know, there's a lot of racial things going on in our country, a lot of awareness being raised, all of this generated by the unfortunate just tragic death of George Floyd at the hands of or knee of a police officer in Minneapolis. So we all know about that, what's going on with that horrible situation. But it has generated a discussion about race in the United States. And more importantly, about, as far as Black people being treated as equal citizens, and some of the things that, are being talked about in the broader sense. Right now, people are going after some of these monuments and symbols erected regarding the Confederacy. The Confederacy is seen different by different Americans. Folks in the South, some of the folks in the South, I'm not speaking for everyone in the South.
No, we have some good people down there in the South.
Yeah. Well, you sound like Trump. There's some good people on both sides. No, let me quit.
No. I have no intention of quoting that man at all. So let's just say decent people. There's some allies. There's some allies in the South.
There's some allies. But in reality, though, there are people in the North and the South that believe the Confederate imagery that you see, the Confederate flags you see flying at, that were flying at NASCAR, flags that the Confederate flag you see on some of our state flags, like the flag of Georgia, I believe the flag of Mississippi as well, that these are simply symbols of the South, of their great culture of the gentleman South, where people sit on their plantations and the slaves are happily playing in the background because they're happy not to be in Africa anymore, and they're just ready to work for a master, and and they're being treated and fed well, so everything is good. And that this war that happened, the Civil War, was simply the North trying to exert itself over the South and be aggressive for no reason whatsoever. It had nothing to do with slavery. Just the North just was on a bad mood one day, decided to swoop down the South and wreak havoc on the poor, innocent Southerners. So that is a narrative you hear from time to time.
I wonder if they're teaching that in schools down there in the South too.
I'm sure that's in the books.
Right, I know. Like, you go to any schools in the South, I have to check with my soror Kendra, who's in education down there, just to find out if they're teaching that in the South, because it sounds like a very plausible story that they would teach in the South about the Civil War.
Oh my God, and don't get me wrong, I understand that some people might believe that. I mean, anytime we talk about some of these Southern symbols, if we talk about taking down the statue of Robert E. Lee, or if we talk about taking down Confederate flags, the Marine Corps and I believe the Marine Corps and the Navy have decided to no longer allow Confederate flags to be flown on military installations, Marine Corps naval installations. I think the Army and the Air Force are following at some point. And this, this upset some people, but the bottom line is, I believe that the commanders and the people in the Department of the Navy have began to understand to tell the real story and to believe the real story of the Confederacy, and the fact that those symbols are basically, it's not just they should be offensive to African Americans as being symbols of slavery, which the war was about, by the way, because the other myth is people believe the war wasn't about slavery. It was about taxes or states' rights, or, they were trying to change their way of life. But the war was about slavery. And the reason I say this, is because if you look at the Articles of Secession from North Carolina or South Carolina or Mississippi or Georgia, specifically the ones from South Carolina I've read recently, 7 places it mentions states' rights. And in 6 of those places, it mentions slavery specifically. And in the other one place, it mentions slaves specifically. So, so the states' right that the Southerners were talking about was to maintain and forward the institution of slavery. It's just that simple. Now, were there some economic interests in the North regarding, we were now shifting from an agricultural economy to a more industrial economy, and therefore we were introducing wage workers and things like that. That was happening. So was that some of the motivation of the North? Pretty sure it was.
Yeah.
But it was also a strong abolitionist push from the North that had been going on for, I think, 20 or 30 years previous to that. So there was a strong push to get rid of slavery on pure idealistic terms. It wasn't attached to a financial or economic reason. So this is the reality of the world that people were living in prior to the beginning of the Civil War.
Well, Richard, I know that you have an extensive background in American history, so I'm really excited to get in this conversation with you because you're absolutely right. So many people have voiced their discontent and their disagreement with the removal of Confederate statues and monuments and the renaming. I mean, it's even drawn this big conversation around getting rid of Aunt Jemima. Like that, it's gone really, really, really far.
Yeah, it's big. Mm-hmm.
And I think the misconception is that it's a needed action to take place, right? People still want to hold on to the idea that there is a heritage that goes along with the Confederate flag, right? Or there is heritage in having that Southern pride. I was just talking to a friend of mine the other day, and I told her, with the removal of Confederate flags at NASCAR races, I now feel like I can actually go see a NASCAR race. Like now I feel comfortable enough to go check. They might have a whole new customer base, fan base to come sweeping through NASCAR now. I get
pretty soon it's gonna be 50 Cent's gonna be sponsoring the car. Jay-Z and Beyonce are gonna start showing up.
Hey, I said, watch out for it, man. That could actually happen.
You never know.
That could actually happen. But
well, it's funny that you say that because people always ask me an example of white privilege. People who say that white privilege doesn't exist, and I always say, okay, this is white privilege. It's not that you're gonna be born into millions of dollars and that you're never going to have a problem in life and you're never going to be unemployed. That's not white privilege. White privilege is this. It is a preference for things that are white, and I should say, by mutual implication, it is the desire to distance yourself or not be those things that are black. But an example of that is if me and you are walking down the street and we see a bunch of white people way down the block and a whole bunch of Confederate flags, it could very readily be a Dukes of Hazzard convention. And they could be the nicest people in the world. But you and I would never know that because we're not going.
Not at all. I was about to say, just like white women see a bunch of black people and like hold on to the man or move over to the other side of the street.
Yeah,
Let us be walking down the street and I see a bunch of white people with Confederate flags. I'm going the other way.
We're turning around.
Going straight. Right, exactly. There's got to be another way around this. Absolutely not. And I think that's where the misconception is too, Richard. I think when we talk about the presentation of this flag and the history behind it, you know, we mentioned before that you have people in the South of all different kinds of backgrounds kind of rocking the Confederate flag. But for those of us who know the truth behind the Confederate flag, we know that as a black person is something that you stay away from. It's not something that's welcoming of the black community. So I'm curious to kind of dive into that conversation when we talk about Southerners who are still holding on to that as pride. It still baffles me in 2020 that people are holding on to this symbol, you know.
Well, you know, I'm going to give a little history on it. All right.
Yes. Here we go.
So first of all, the whole idea of slavery being the predicate for the Civil War, you had 1/3 of the population in the South owned the majority of the slaves. 2/3 probably owned maybe less than 3%, I guess. Okay. So the majority of slaves are being held by a very small group of very rich people. It gave them an unfair labor advantage on all the poor white farmers in the South. You know, they were trudging it out. These big plantations with 300, 400 slaves. So it really didn't benefit the average white Southerner. So Jefferson Davis and the boys, when they decided that they wanted to maintain slavery as the country moved west, you know, when they wanted to go into the new Western territories and still be able to maintain that labor advantage by continuing slavery and bringing slaves. All right, this caused a problem. Now they had to figure out, how do we, as only 1/3 of the population, get the other 2/3 to come fight for something that doesn't benefit them at all? It has no economic benefit for them. None. Sure. All right. In fact, it was the opposite. Okay. It allowed them to have an unfair labor distortion that caused them to have an unfair advantage. As far as their farms getting bigger and they're making more money, and the smaller farms getting smaller and shrinking and disappearing. In any case, what happens after that is they come up with an idea. This is when they really begin to brand white supremacy. Don't get me wrong, prior to that, of course, the poor whites, and I think you guys touched on this yesterday, during some of the rebellions that happened in the 17th century and 18th century. In the early 1700s and late 1600s. Mm-hmm. What you had was rebellions.
For people who couldn't figure out what centuries you were referring to.
Well, I couldn't. That's why I had to clarify for myself. This wasn't for y'all. This is for me. All right. So make sure. Am I talking about 19? I want to make sure.
Right.
All right. So the late 1600s and the 1700s, before the United States becomes the United States. Yes. Anyway, poor whites had a habit of getting together with poor blacks. So those indentured servants that were poor whites, often Irish or even English, just debtors' prisons were just broke. They were not stupid like Americans today. They knew they had more in common with these black slaves than they had with the landowners. So they would occasionally get together and tear stuff up, you know. And the landowner class got smart towards the end of the 1600s and the early 1700s. They started getting smart and saying, wait a minute. Okay, these poor whites and these poor blacks and these slaves and indentured servants, they just getting along too well together. We got to break this up. So they introduced all you poor whites, all you whites that are indentured servants. Guess what? You're white. They go, really? Yeah, you get to be included in whiteness. We're going to put you in the white club. So they got to join the white club, but they still didn't get all the privileges. You know, like they didn't have the platinum card. They had that one Capital One version of whiteness, you know, that $300 limit.
Right. They just had a card, right? They still had a
$300 limit.
Yeah, right.
But it created that rift between those two working class groups at that time, even though they were slaves. Fast forward till we get the Civil War. It's kind of hard coded. Whites are whites, blacks are blacks, you know. You still have some free blacks in the country, because we have our African American brothers and sisters who like to claim they're only descended from free blacks. I'm like, okay, y'all can have that. All right, but anyway,
I
so
didn't know that was a thing. I have to look
oh,
into
that's
that.
the thing. That's a bourgeois thing, man. Don't get them. They'll tell you in a minute. I'm
Okay.
descended from free blacks, sir. My ancestors were never slaves. Okay. I'd be like, all right, I can't say what I would say, but you can only imagine. All right.
Sure.
Anyway, so we get to the Civil War, and Jefferson Davis and them decide we're going to use white supremacy as a way to get these other 2/3 to come fight for us, because 1/3 of the South can't beat the North. They know that. They can't get enough soldiers. So they start getting newspaper articles in Kentucky papers, North Carolina papers, talking about, oh my God, if they let the slaves free, they will begin to marry your daughters. Oh God, there comes a big black penis is going to be coming after your little white daughters.
It
All
scares
right.
them.
That scares them.
It's
And you're going
scary.
to and you'll be on the same level of them, and you won't be able to, you're just going to be just like the Negroes, blah, blah, blah. The two races shouldn't be together. If you read the newspaper articles from before the Civil War starts or during the Civil War, it really lays out the idea of white supremacy, very hard coded. There is no mistaking the language. Jefferson Davis's vice president was very clear in saying how much he didn't like African Americans or blacks or slaves or Negroes, whatever they called it at the time. Their great general, Robert E. Lee, he was torn on the issue. He said, well, slavery is a bad thing, but the Negro is better off here in the United States than they would be in Africa anyway. It's our Christian duty to make sure that they are civilized. There'll be a stronger race out of this. And this is really more of a burden to white people than it is to black people. Slavery actually hurt them more than it hurt black folks, as far as he was concerned. But he must, go ahead.
That's kind of like what parents. Not to interrupt you, but real quick, that's kind of like what parents used to say when they give their child's whooping. Like, it's gonna hurt me more than it hurts you. No, that's not true. I don't believe that at all. This hurts. No. This hurts really a lot, actually.
Exactly. So, but that's what they were saying. You have people that still say that now. We have black people that say that. Thomas Sowell and Candace Owens and Alan West and all those group of brothers and sisters, I'm going to call them.
Yeah,
they have a habit of saying that, we're better off because of slavery. I'm like, Lord to Jesus, but I'm not
just like the white blessing that Pastor Giglio, I think it was.
I saw that, the white blessing of slavery.
Yes, the white blessing of slavery. So, and I think I would be remiss not to say, as I'm standing in for Cynthia McDonald, I think it's very important that we identify that chattel slavery, there was nothing nice, there was nothing easy, there was nothing simple, there was nothing kind about chattel slavery.
Absolutely.
The way that blacks and Africans at the time, African Americans, I guess we can potentially call them at that point, were treated was horrific. It was horrendous. And although people say that there were slave owners, kind of like Robert E. Lee potentially, who may have treated their slaves well, there was nothing about the treatment of slaves that was good or beneficial to a race of people. In fact, we are still seeing intergenerational trauma from what was passed down from slavery, from our ancestors and so on in slavery. So I think while I just had to, I know that's something that Cynthia McDonald would be proud to make.
And I'm glad that you brought that up, because people are under the erroneous impression that this was something that a long time ago, and how does people refuse to acknowledge how this affects us today. They believe that because slavery ended in 1865 on paper, that it was all well and good and everyone lived happily ever after. That's what people like to believe, because nations don't like remembering traumatic things. And that's just how history goes. People don't like remembering the bad things their country does, because then it exposes their gods to be not so perfect. Mm-hmm. And the gods in this country being the founding fathers, or, in the case that we're talking about of the South, the gods being Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee. That is the gods of that particular neo-Confederate religion that we have going on. So, to be quick, because I can be wordy. So, Rick, let me know if I'm being wordy. Just tell me shut up.
Okay. I'm on it. I jumped in every now and then.
but
I'm loving the history lesson, and I think people need to hear and understand what was taking place.
Right. So we get to the Civil War. Jefferson Davis and them convinced these poor white folk, to the tunes of 300 to 500,000, depending on who you listen to, go and die to maintain their labor advantage, okay? Because these blacks are inferior. All right, so the war begins, it ends, blah, blah, blah. We know they lose, all right? Now, When they lose, here's the real history of what happens when they lose.
Wait a minute. I'm sorry, Richard. One more time. What happened? They what?
Oh, I
Did you
said,
say they lost?
they lost.
They lost.
Yes,
Okay.
the
I just want to
Confederates
make sure that
lost.
we throw that
Yes,
back out there that they lost, because that's going to
as
be an
your boy,
important part of
boy
this.
Trump said, losers. They're
With
losers.
the
They lost
capital,
big.
they
It was
lost.
big. They
It was
lost. They
it
lost
was a great
bigly.
loss. It was a very big loss.
They lost bigly. Bigly. They lost bigly, as he would say.
Oh, as long as we got
All right.
that covered, that they lost.
Yes,
Okay. All
they
right. Got it.
lost. So when they lose, all right, let me explain. Now, I have a problem as a historian of us taking people in history and trying to put modern morality on them. Like, I have a big problem with people saying Christopher Columbus, this and that. I'm like, Christopher Columbus kind of was a guy. That's how they did things back then. That's how it worked. I don't care if you were European, African, a Native American, or Amerindian, or First Nations. That's how it worked. People came, they took, they raped, they killed. That's what they did. I'm not saying it was right, but it's hard. You really shouldn't put our morality on a situation like that, because it's just this
They
shoot. At
didn't have
that
the
time,
same
I think,
culture.
yeah, when Christopher Columbus came, I don't even think the Enlightenment hadn't even happened yet. I think it just started. So people were just now coming to the concept of personal liberty and freedom. All right. However, nonetheless, not for nothing, I'm saying this. Is my paisan saying, not for nothing. Well, since we talk about Christopher Columbus, not for nothing, I'm saying this, eh?
There you
But
go. Throw
but
that
when
Italian
we
in
talk
there.
about Robert E. Lee, let's judge him by the moment he was in, not by our morality, not
Sure.
because we don't like slavery or we don't think it's racist. Let's take him at the moment with his colleagues and peers. All right. General Lee went to West Point. A whole bunch of those guys, all those generals went to West Point. It was very serious. People don't understand honor and code. You know, like Jack Nicholson, A Few Good Men, code, honor, loyalty. That was real back then. It wasn't no joke. They kill you for being a coward. Meaning, if you rightfully were trying to run the other way and people trying to kill you, your own people would kill you as being a coward. That's how they got down. The military wasn't no joke back then. They still had a lot of those old European traditions about honor and code, and that stuff came from the Roman way of doing war. All right, those were
Absolutely.
so. Understand that he went to West Point with these guys. These guys served with him in many different campaigns, his fellow generals. All right. Pretty much all of them, when the war was over, they wanted to execute him and every damn Confederate general officer, period. Execute. They had a thing before the Uniform Code of Military Justice called the 101 Articles of War, I believe is what it was called. And there were so many things that get you put to death. One of them was treason. All right. Turning against the Constitution, the president, the country. That was it. And they weren't playing. General Montgomery Meigs, it's those of you who want to look this up to make sure I'm not spitballing this. General Montgomery Meigs was one of the people. He was the quartermaster general of the United States Army under President Lincoln, and he went to West Point and served under General Lee. And all these generals admired General Lee. He was a
They
great
did.
general. They admired him, but they were like, "This is all on you." To put it in the LBC vernacular, because it's all on you, homie. That's what it was. It's all on you, homie. And they wanted him dead. They wanted to execute him, and everybody looked like him. That means every Confederate officer, the rank of lieutenant colonel and above, dead. And Jefferson Davis dead. And the
So,
only thing that stopped that, Abraham Lincoln.
well, let me look at that for a second, because it sounds to me like they wanted him dead because of one big reason, and this is something that I've recently heard being kind of thrown around or tossed around. The biggest threat to the American flag is not anyone taking a knee during a national anthem. It's not actually even people burning the flag, but it's actually the Confederate flag. The Confederate flag is the biggest threat and treasonous action brought against our current United States of America. So it sounds like they wanted them dead because they committed treason.
Absolutely. It was treason. And people want to say, I heard some neo-Confederates try to defend it, say, well, we committed treason against England, so that means we're all traitors. I said, well, none of us are subjects of the crown of England, and therefore we're not traitors. And I'm sure that if we had lost the Revolutionary War, I'm sure George Washington then would have been executed as traitors. All right. But they won.
Well, but we won.
Right. So, the commercials say sprinklers are for winners. Well, guess what? Being not called a traitor is for winners. Losers get called traitor. That's how it works. That's how the game works. So in reality, they lost the war. They were going to be executed. Abraham Lincoln in his statesmanship, understood that executing them may not be the best thing to do. All right. So he decides to say, no, we're not going to execute him, but we're going to take all his land. That's why his land, his old farm, all that land he owned is Arlington Cemetery, because the generals demanded that that be dedicated to the war dead. It be a reminder to General Lee to the rest of his life. This is what you did. All right. So again, we're judging him by the morality and the code of honor that they did at that day. I'm not projecting what I feel. This is how they felt. He was a damn traitor. He should have been executed. End of story. Jefferson Davis, traitor, executed. End of story. But since they weren't executed, they were laying around trying to get work. Jefferson Davis began to start writing. He started, and he was so just basically looked at as such a lowlife that he had to try to, well, you know what? It was just this noble cause that, we just wanted to maintain our. He begins to immediately to rewrite history. He begins to immediately revise history. We call it revisionist history. Mm-hmm. So what these Southerners believe is their heritage is a lie. It's a story predicated on a lie, someone trying to redeem their reputation because they lost all their honor. So they were trying to redeem it in their last days. And then, of course, unfortunately, those Southerners that were still there, they were pretty pissed they lost. And then all of us, our ancestors, I'm assuming you're like me, one of the black folk that have slave ancestors, not free ancestors.
I am an American.
Okay. I just want to make sure. I don't want to offend you, sir.
No trouble, sir. Nope, no trouble at all.
You're going to make me go slave. No trouble, sir. No, sir.
Since we're talking about the Confederacy. No.
You might be one of them free black folks, sir. No trouble.
No,
sir. Not like us regular Negroes.
I actually have the descendants of slavery, so we're on the same level.
All right.
I still gotta look up that descendants of free blacks. I just
oh my God, don't get man. You don't want that smoke with them people.
Okay,
they're serious about that. But anyway, though, so as our ancestors, when they got free, they began. Our ancestors. I'm gonna hate to say this, and let me put this out there I be seeing this little hashtag. We are not our ancestors. Like that mean we bout it.
Yes, but I love that hashtag. Like I
don't because our ancestors, what our ancestors did after chains came off, literally after they were literally working the fields, when they found out they were free on Juneteenth, all right, Texas, wherever, guess what they did? Unlike us, who make every excuse why we can't do nothing, they said, let's build together.
Yeah.
And they went immediately. Yeah, we're not our ancestors. We punks. They was about the business because they went and built cities and they went and built businesses and they ran for office and they were doing so damn well that the Southern Baptist Church, no offense against my Southern Baptist Church people, I know y'all repented of this, but they like to say it was a Democratic Party, but it was the Southern Baptist Church and the Democratic Party that started the Ku Klux Klan in the South.
I was going to say, I was doing some reading earlier, actually, from a post that I saw from Professor Carol Swain, who's a poli-sci and law professor at Vanderbilt, and she kind of broke down where the Democratic Party and the Republican Party were different in who was supporting slavery and who was against slavery, being the Democrats, where the Democratic Party was in support of slavery. I just saw a comment from Cynthia McDonald.
Hey, Cynthia.
Watching Cynthia.
I know she's like, don't let them go off the rails, Rick. Keep them under control.
I'm so glad
that boy ain't right in the head.
You just let me know how I'm doing. I'm trying to be the supervising parent.
You know you ain't right in the head, Rick. keep on task.
I'm not that good at being an adult. I'm not that good at adulthood. I'm not. But as you were mentioning with the Southern Baptist Church, and again, here's where we unfortunately have the entrance of religion again. Kind of being that force that has protected slavery. And I didn't know that there was the creation of the Ku Klux Klan there too as well. But when we talk about the role that they play, the Democratic Party and the KKK or the Southern Baptist Church, I'm wondering how they were able to hold on to that institution the way that they did.
Well, let me be clear, all right, because I was talking to one of my Muslim friends today. I think she's watching. And she was, Muslims are quick to tell us about this slave-minded Christianity.
Whoa, I mean, real quick. That's the first go-to.
We go, oh Lord, here they go. But there's some truth to that. I have to say there's some truth to that.
Sure.
But also, on the other hand, so you have to look at it. There's a dichotomy there. Abolitionists were Christians, all right. And Quakers and Amish, whenever we escape, they're the ones who help us get to Canada. You know what I'm saying? Those are Christians.
Them Quakers and Amish are like, I want to high five them every time I see them. Like, y'all ancestors, how my ancestors.
Yeah, they rolling with the wagon. I'm like, hey, you know what? Y'all got that wagon, but y'all good with me. You know, but the reality
shout out to any of the Amish and Quakers that might be watching. I don't even know if Quakers
they ain't watching. Somebody gonna tell them about what we're talking.
That's right. Oh, right.
They
Because they have TVs. Yeah, right.
At least that's what they say. I don't believe that. They probably got some hidden stuff down there.
I feel like they've been somewhere out protesting Black Lives Matter as well. So they get the information some kind of way.
And they get it. They do something. They get with it. But so there were Christians that supported slavery, and there were Christians that were completely against the institution of slavery. That is a history lesson that I'm not going to do because that goes back to the Puritan times, and it is very interesting history of the church in America. The church in America has always been divided down a certain line, and that white nationalism line has been a dividing point for American Christians since it started.
I was going to say, do we call that the Mason-Dixon line? Is that what y'all?
Well, I call it I-80 in Illinois, sir.
Oh, well, sure. That's that too.
I'm sorry. Let me leave my Southern Illinois people alone. Y'all all right.
Hey, I'm a part of SIU.
When I get down past 80, though, man, I start seeing Confederate flags. You stop at the gas station. You leave Joliet, 15 minutes. You stop. You got the gas station. You got somebody. How y'all doing? I'm like, am I in Kentucky? What the hell?
I'm telling you, man. I've been saying it. There are two states that Mason-Dixon line should have ran through. It should have cut through Jersey, and it should have cut right underneath Kankakee in Illinois. Bring that on up a little bit.
Shoot, right underneath Crown Point in Indiana. Shoot, everything down there. I'm like, I'm part of the union? What the hell? You know? I'm confused. What's going on over here? But anyway, let me quit. There's good people on both sides of that line, sir. But but anyway,
you said it this time.
But for real though, all right. So what you get? I forgot what I was talking about.
We were talking about the ability that the Democratic Party and the Southern Baptist Church were able to hold on.
So you did have a Northern Baptist Church too, all right? And those white Christians helped start some of our historically Black colleges, you know? So like I said, it is, Ethan, here you go. It is intellectually fraudulent and academically lazy to posit that Christianity was simply a tool of white supremacy. That is a very significant oversimplification. Okay, because the reality is you had Christians on both sides of it. So what does that tell us? That tells us that a religious ideology is merely a tool, and people will use that tool for whatever social political agenda they have. All right, it's just that simple.
They always have.
And so understand this, and I'm not going to preach today. Let me speak on tongue. Bellable Shanta. Let me get a towel wet.
Listen,
I'm not going to preach on this today.
A collection today.
No.
But your co-host Cynthia McDonald did point out that might be a future show, Christianity or the church and chattel slavery. I like that. I'm definitely tuning in for that.
We would talk about that. I don't know. Cynthia scares me when she get on Christian topic. I'd be quiet. You know, I'd be like Smokey on Friday. I'd be quiet. But when she leaves, I'll be talking again. But so anyway. Yes, so you had Christianity on both sides of that. Like you got Christians, like take for now, even today in modern society, you got Christians that are for Trump. You got Christians that hate Trump. Sure. You got Christians that are Black Lives Matter Christians. You got Christians that damn near alt-right white nationalists. All right. Now, they're both Christians, right? And they both seem to support their beliefs predicated on the scriptures they believe. So obviously somebody's wrong in that equation. Both can't be right.
Right.
All right. Now, I think that those who are about righteousness are always right. And racism ain't never been righteous, regardless of how people wish to interpret the Bible. Oh, and I've seen a few Christians want to do that. Oh, by the way, my other master degree is theology. Bring it if you want to have that discussion. All right.
Oh, no.
I'd love to talk to some of these Christians. Well, you know, the Bible does teach the races are supposed to be separate. And now you read that in Exodus. That's all I'm saying. Now you colored folk, y'all can go to church. You got to be separate. I wish one of y'all would.
I can't believe that. Go ahead.
I'm from the suburbs. I wish you would. I wish you would.
I'm not doing this with you. I think, you know, when you make that point of that people still have that belief, and it's crazy to me that people still have that belief. Then again, I'm not surprised because we still have people that believe the Confederate flag is a symbol of heritage and not a symbol of slavery. Mm-hmm. You know, and to be clear, for those that are watching that may have a misconception, and by all means, please share any of your comments or questions in the commenter section placed there so we can read them here on the screen. When we talk about slavery and the Civil War being 100% predicated on the institution of slavery, there was a superior and inferior war that took place, basically, right? White superiority, white supremacy versus and the creation and ideology that blacks are yet inferior, right? Or even the indigenous Americans are inferior, but at this point they're pushed aside or almost swept completely out, and we have the overwhelming amount of African slaves who are looked at as being inferior. And what we see today in that Confederate flag is that representation. It's the symbol that says, hey, you all are still inferior. Absolutely. You all as Black people are not qualified to be on the same playing field or level as white people. And that's what I don't understand, how people don't get that.
Well, they don't want to. And they, we just guessed in this country, sir. We just guessed that white man allows us to live here. We should be happy.
And there it is. And
that's what it is. We should be happy. They freed us from slavery, and now we just be happy, sir. The white man, them good white folks, let us stay here, sir.
And yes, they do. So let's talk about the people of color, specifically Black people down in the South, who still rock the Confederate flag like it's fashion and call it Southern pride.
Lord to Jesus.
Right. So I wonder if that's Stockholm syndrome, but like they weren't slaves, right? But I think the mentality, Richard, is just that, right? It's this mentality that, hey, this is Massa's land, and Massa is doing good by letting me stay here and field and plow and have my own. Because then we still ain't got 40 acres and a mule yet. So this little land that they got, they feel happy, and there they are supporting Massa with his Confederate flag symbols. What is that?
I think that is. I'm not a psychologist, but I play one on TV. I think that there is some type of social psychology that goes there, some type of cultural brainwashing. Some type of idea of wanting to fit in with where you live, and because they have friends, like they have, I'm sure I have friends that have Confederate flags. I don't know what they do. I'm sure that they know because they're more open with them down there. And they're probably real nice people, the type of people that, help you if your car break down, this, that. And I've seen interracial couples, Black women with white men, white women with Black men. I've seen them with Confederate flags on. I just sit there and wonder what type of sexual role playing is going on in that house. Because I can only imagine. I know it's wrong to think that way, but that's the first thought that crossed my mind.
Well, but
you with some slave role playing, and she got you out with what?
That. I mean, and look, let's be clear for some of that may be watching. I want to get to Cynthia's comment too there in just a second. For some people that may be watching, there is a fetish, and at times Black people are sexually fetishized by white Americans. There is a fetish there, and I mean, the fetishes can go so many different ways. But you bring up an interesting point. Like, if in the event y'all are rocking both Confederate, like, what's going on there? Like,
I'm wondering.
I'm pretty sure somebody's a fetish there.
Yeah, I don't want to look at. I don't want to think that, but I'm like, well, it looks like to me. I don't even want to know. You know what I'm saying? I mean, you got the sister walking around with Confederate headband on, and I'm like, Lord,
I saw that when I lived in Richmond, Virginia, and shout out to all the people that I got a chance to meet when I lived in Richmond, because Richmond was at the time the Confederate capital, considered the Confederate capital of the country. And, so again, I 100% felt like I was a guest when I lived in Richmond, like, let's be clear. But I met some great people. I did. I really met some outstanding people there. In fact, a good friend of mine who is really fighting for anti-racism talks about the descendants that she's aware of in her family who owned slaves, and has really been fighting for changing perspective and fighting for the anti-racism within her own community and her own circle. But while I lived there, it was really bad. I think that was the first time I got exposed to seeing Black people rocking Confederate flags as like attire. It was a complete mind-blowing experience. I've been taught all my life that this emblem, in school represents hatred and racism and slavery. Yet you get to the South and there are people who are rocking this like, nah, son, we from the South. This is what we do. Like, no.
It's like if a bunch of Jewish people were walking around with swastikas on, as far as I'm concerned.
I mean, yes.
It's like
Make
come
it
on.
make sense, Richard. Make it make sense, because that's about
But
the same.
I guess it is culturalized down there. They're told. Some people that actually believe that the kindly General Lee who treated his slaves nicely was at one point going to release them someday. He just didn't want the North telling them when to do it. I guess is what they was on. But
And
the
that's
reality,
actually a
yeah,
point that Cynthia brought up too in her comment that I wanted to touch on. She said, "Remember the people that are in the South that say the slaves were happy."
of course, our niggers is happy down here, sir. You stirring up the good black folk down here with them ideas of freedom.
And there were slaves who
Don't
felt the
sound like
same
it.
way. Especially the ones that were in the house, right?
Mhm.
We know that they got treated decent, from what I guess a specific perspective might allow it to be seen. But at the end of the day, there was nothing decent about not even
Yeah.
being in the house. There was nothing decent
There was
about
nothing decent
being a
about that.
slave.
I mean, being obviously, average African American has 12 to 18% European ancestry. Most of the time, that is not by consensual relationships. So when we look back, you know, the house slaves might have had it worse in a lot of ways because they had to take care of them other duties, you know, and
So yeah,
yeah. So people always talk about the house slave, but I think the field and house slaves had it as bad for different reasons,
exactly.
and all the sellout slaves wasn't the house slaves. There's someone in the fields going to telling,
Of
master,
course.
they's about to leave, master, and next thing you know, somebody getting lynched. But
And I talked about that on the 13% last week, and I think it boasts to say again, slave women were raped, slave men were hung, and all of that just because the master wanted to teach his young boy how to lynch and how to be a man, and it was taken out on slaves. There is nothing decent
yeah,
about
nothing.
slavery treatment, not specifically chattel slavery that America
No,
engaged in. I always
and let
have to
me
say chattel slavery to be
And
clear
let me
because I want to
dispel
make
let me
Cynthia proud.
dispel this particular myth that I hear some of my Christian brothers and sisters talk about when they talk about the slavery of the Jews in Egypt, or they talk about the slavery in Rome that the Romans practiced, and everybody in the world practiced slavery.
Go
Well,
ahead,
let me
Richard.
explain this
Go ahead and break it down. I'm here.
real quick. All
Yes.
right. Those type of slaveries, if you looked in Rome, teachers and doctors were slaves. They were never considered not human. Everybody knew they were human.
Everybody knew
There
they were
was
human.
no, they weren't the slaves weren't human. All right, the Jews, even when the Jewish people, when the Hebrews were slaves under Pharaoh, he knew they were human. Joseph was one of when the Hebrews first got to Egypt. Joseph was number 2 in command. They knew he was a human being, and so was his brothers and their descendants. There was never this question of these people not being human beings.
But here,
Chattel slavery, the Africans as less than human, as less than a horse or dog or a cow. You and I talked before about the fact with when that police officer killed George Floyd, that if you or I were to take a dog right now on the street and put our knees in that dog's neck, we'd have people trying to beat the crap out of us. All right, we'd be
and for those people
charged.
who,
We'd be
for those
charged.
people who may not know that or need a visual of that, just check out the Amy Cooper, Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper story over in Central Park. When
Exactly.
the way she strangled that dog, they came and got that dog real quick.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
when
If
it
she
came
was
to
bringing a black man, they were like, "Well, what was he doing before it happened?"
they were still talking about,
You
well, we have to investigate the video, so
know,
on and so forth.
man, a white
No.
person can shoot a black baby, and they'll be like, "Well, the baby was did he have a weapon in his
They'll
diaper?"
call it black on black crime. Is
Yeah.
what they'll call it.
Well, like, what was he? Did he have a weapon in his diaper? I checked his preschool record, and he had done some things. Some people are always gonna have an excuse. But anyway, let me get back to my professor self. Okay, so
wait, Cynthia has another comment, and I love that she's engaging. Cynthia, you listen. We can switch it, but I love the fact that you were still engaging here. Keep us on track too as well. She mentioned, and the white women that also owned and participated in slavery treated the women assigned to treated them like pets. The women they were assigned to treat them like pets.
And that's a good point that Cynthia brings up. A lot of times you have people believing that white women were somehow as victimized at the time I guess they were victimized by, of course, their white husbands being having sex with the black female slaves whenever they wanted to. That might have been traumatic to them, but I'm sure they survived it. But in all actuality, the white women were often more brutal to the black women slaves than the white men were out of that jealousy, you know.
Yeah.
And that's all. And I bring this up because we get to this point in American society where we have this, where, and I'm going to say this, and I hope nobody gets upset with me. Black feminism, all right, is always fascinating to me. You will talk to some black women who act like the black man is the biggest enemy that they have, and race is secondary, and their gender is primary. I'm here to tell you that is unequivocally not true. And don't get me wrong. I'm not saying black women don't go through their fair share of unique situations because of them being women, and they got that double whammy. I think black women are probably, in this country treated as the lowest thing, lower than black men.
Yeah.
Black men, we're treated as animals, but we're celebrated for our strength and abilities to be able to dunk basketballs and this and that. Whereas black women are treated as, they're always got an attitude. If they ever speak up for themselves, it's they're being threatening and this and that. And unfortunately, ever since slavery, we've made black women carry the water for black men. Honestly speaking, and I think this has caused a pathology in our community where we expect black girls to grow up and be adults by age 12, and black boys or black men to be perpetually boys into their 40s. It's really a sad pathology.
Very true.
When you look at that situation with R. Kelly, for example, when R. Kelly was peeing on 14-year-old girls and whatever he was doing, it was unfortunate. A lot of black women, well, they grown. I mean, they get, they grown. What, I couldn't understand that, but that just goes to show. I understand there's a uniqueness to being a black woman in America, and I understand that black women get the short end of the stick more than anyone else. But also understand that my sisters need to understand that white women can be your allies, but at the end of the day, we are each other's ally, and we got to have each other's back. And I fault the brothers for not having the sisters back as much as they should.
Man,
we need to step up.
Yeah, we
sisters
do.
always got us.
Always.
So they always got us. So we need to step up and be equal in that manner.
And
but
as
that
I've been
being
doing
said,
this anti-racism work, I've been uncovering some of that same sentiment that needs to take place within our community between men and women, between brothers and sisters.
Absolutely.
There is so much more of a responsibility that we should be taking when it comes to speaking up for the treatment of black women in our country.
Well, take Terry Crews. Take Terry Crews, for example.
Please don't.
What he did with Gabrielle Union. All right. When Gabrielle Union spoke up about how she was being treated, he turned, and I hope I don't bump into him. He's much bigger than me, but he turned, I hope I don't bump it. But he did turn into, Master been good to us, sir. I don't know what she's talking about.
Yes, he did. He turned
Master done been good to us.
Oh man,
no sir.
I read that. I was like, you're kidding me. Come on, man. Don't put the whole gender on blast. Just because, but here it is. You're absolutely right. That is 100% what happens and what we see when it comes to how we should be stepping up and taking responsibility for the treatment of black women in this country.
Absolutely.
And we're failing.
And let me deal with an ignorant statement I've seen people say. A lot of times sisters will say, why don't black men protect us? And I've seen some ignorant brothers say, I ain't supposed to protect you. I'm only responsible for the women in my family. Okay, let's as the great 21st century philosopher Cat Williams said, let's just knock it off. Knock it off now. Let's not do that. All right. Knock it off.
Isn't he a great philosopher, that Cat Williams?
Yeah.
Shout out to Cat Williams. If you ever get a hold of this show, we'll get him on here too.
Yeah, I would love to have Cat Williams on the show. I want to have Cat Williams and Candace Owens. That's the show I want to see.
Oh yeah, I'll be here for that. Yeah.
Oh, I can't wait. Go, but anyway. But black women aren't saying that you and I are responsible for every black woman in the world that I got to go and jump in front of a bullet for. What they're saying is we got to support our sisters like they support us. When something is wrong that's being dealt with black women, we need to be right there, and we need to be right next to them and fighting for it, and sometimes stepping in front of them and fighting for it, like they do with us.
Yes.
So that's what they're saying. Because like I said, I've seen a lot of brothers get ignorant about it. Of course, you're responsible for the women in your family or your friends or your wife or your mother, your sister. But we're talking about in a cultural and societal way that we need to be there for each other. Because the sisters, man, they've been there the whole time. They've been protecting us since we were slaves.
Since we were slaves.
When we were slaves, a black man had to hide behind his mother, because the white man, she had to teach the black boy. Unfortunately, there was things she had to teach him to keep him safe. Don't raise your voice at the master. Don't stand up straight because it's going to scare them. These are survival techniques, unfortunately, that I believe have been passed generationally still.
I was
Because
just gonna say
the sisters still protect the brothers. And let me be clear. Let me do a Barack. No, let me be clear here. All right. I have often talked about the pathology in our community of the crime that we have. And let me be clear. I'm not saying that black on black crime is a subject that takes away from anything else, from police brutality, nothing. These are separate issues. But when I do talk about black on black crime, I'll say, look, we need to do better as a group with each other. We need to do better. And the biggest group of people that come at me when I say brothers need to make better choices is sisters. They're like, oh, no, don't get on the brothers. I'm like, hold on, sis. I get you got a maternal instinct with them. All right. I'm man up, I'm Adam, we're out dog. Stand up, man. All right. Sister, you getting on the brother. You gotta understand they got a lot going on. I understand. Yeah, I've been black for 50 years and male all of them. I understand what they got going on.
Speaking of,
but
are you
I
still
gotta
celebrating
ask,
that 50th?
Yes, oh God. Don't
I mean,
right.
it's an annual celebration, man. You should just be celebrating all year long. As soon as we can open up, we going out. But go ahead.
All right. But the reality is that the sisters do carry the water for the brothers. They protect us at all costs. Unfortunately, sometimes I think it has a negative result. I think we need to really start taking care of our black girls, letting them be able to be girls and grow up to be women, as opposed to trying to make them grown early, and make them taken care of, responsible for stuff. And black men need to stop. Black men need to stop using that damn excuse because the sisters allow us to, and just man the hell up. The sisters are always going to understand what we're going through. So quit using that as an excuse not to do better.
Exactly.
My daddy wasn't in the household. Okay, get over it, cuz. Let's do what we got to do. Well, I didn't have a good job. Okay, we know that now. So let's try to work on doing something different.
Yeah.
But I ain't gonna preach on that. But I see we got a question there. Go ahead.
Okay.
That one from Joni. Well, it's one of my classmates from back when I was a youngster in my youth, when I was young and giving into foolishness. She says, can I chime in and ask, as a white elementary teacher in a very diverse school, how do you recommend the discussion of slavery be changed from the usual fifth grade social studies book? What needs to change in these early discussions about history? I'm glad you asked that question.
What a great question.
As a historian, let me say this. Joni, what I think that what needs to happen even when our children are young, obviously the language has to be sanitized, has to be presented in a way that they can understand. But I think we need to make it very clear that this was not simply they lived out in the field house here and the bachelor lived in the big house, and they might have had older clothes, they had new clothes. We have to explain the dehumanizing factor there and how that resonates and how that has an impact on modern society. I think, as we start building on that from younger children, as they get into high school, we teach them in history classes and, government classes, we teach how things work. I think when teaching or social sciences classes in general, if we give them that foundation of understanding that this was something that was wrong, it happened in American society, and it wasn't just about, they were slaves, that this was a dehumanization and the taking away of the essential inalienable rights that our country are founded on, of life, liberty, and property. And if we start with that foundation and build on it as the children get older, I think that they'll have a true understanding of why this is something that affects the modern socioeconomic and social political realities we have in the United States.
And also, I think, Joni, when you raise that question, it's important for us to consider that, and I've learned this with as many educators as I've had the chance to engage with. You're up against a really big political system when it comes to changing curriculum. We understand that there is the administration and there's politics behind that really goes into how you engage and educate students, and you got the parents, right? You got parents that also feel that their child should or should not learn about certain things. It was very fast. It was very fascinating to me when Chicago introduced the history of LGBTQ communities in schools, and the parents were in an uproar talking about they don't want their kids learning about same-gender sex. And it's like, no one's talking about that. They're talking about the history of this marginalized community. And the people who were able to fight for equality in that community. So parents get outrageous too as well. So you're up against a lot. You
there's
really
a lot for teachers. Yeah, Joni, he's right. I understand teachers go. There's a lot of politics involved. You got to be careful. But if you strictly treat it academically, and if you have an academic basis for the arguments you're presenting or the facts that you're presenting, I think that goes a long way. But you're right. You have to go against the administration. You got parents get upset about things, and it can get crazy. But yeah, if we start them off with that understanding, this was a dehumanizing thing, and that it was done on purpose to dehumanize a group of people, then we can build upon that as they get older. Because I'm often shocked at the lack of understanding of basic American history people have, i.e., people believing that that the Civil War wasn't about slavery and that General Lee wasn't a traitor. And I know Ethan had asked something earlier, and he wanted me to clarify. General Lee was a traitor because he took an oath at West Point when he became an officer, a second lieutenant in the United States Army, to serve and protect, or to serve and defend the United States of America, to follow the orders of the President of the United States, and to support the Constitution of the United States. An oath of honor back then, it wasn't like today. We say an oath, we make a promise, okay, you break it, okay, who cares? Back then, it was serious business. He was an officer in the United States Army, and it was very serious. That's why they wanted to kill him, because he was a complete traitor to those core values of the United States Army of the 1800s. So again, I'm not projecting our uniform code of military justice of today. That is predicated on the 101 articles of war that were was to guide his military conduct at that particular time. So that's why he should have been executed. But we understand why Abraham Lincoln chose not to. And that's the reality of the situation.
Hey, and I don't know, and maybe our producer behind the scenes can help me out here. If Joni was watching via Facebook or if she was watching via YouTube, but Shane Thomas had a really great comment about if children are playing violent video games, and he says if children are playing violent video games and going to Marvel and DC movies, you can tell them the truth about slavery. And then he goes on to also say there was a young woman on Twitter who didn't know who John Brown was. How is that? Oh, I'm sorry. I said Shane. Is that Sherry? That's Sherry. Sherry. Is that how you say it? Or Sherry? Mm-hmm. Sherry or Sherry? Please forgive me for mispronouncing your first name. I didn't catch that it was actually spelled. I thought it was Shane from the screen that I was looking at. Completely my apologies. But what a great point that is brought up there, that if kids are playing these violent video games, how watered down then do you need slavery to be? I mean, I remember playing Mortal Kombat as a kid, and we taking off heads and decapitating. I mean, and just some brutality. In fact, I think that was actually a statement.
Yeah, there was
brutality, right? You know what I mean?
Brutality.
It was so I feel like there may not have to be too much of watering down of what slavery actually was, especially the dehumanization part of it.
Absolutely. And by the way, I was always Raiden when I played Mortal Kombat. I relate to him, because he's a god.
Who's this Raiden? Because Raiden's always my go-to too. Raiden was my go-to, and then
Sub-Zero is my backup.
Sub-Zero.
Raiden is my guy.
We on the same page. Yes. Yeah. Cynthia, I promise I'm not taking over. You're coming back. And Sherry, thank you so much for clarifying. Again, my apologies there. But I think that I can't get over when we talk about, unfortunately, the people who, and I have to say this, we've known that there's been a difference in, I want to say speed, but we'll just say difference in thought process between the North and the South. Do you think that is what takes the precedence of why the Southerners don't really accept that their Confederates flag and paraphernalia and so on and so forth stands for slavery, stands for racism, because their thought process isn't as something as the North?
I wouldn't say that. I believe that they've been culturally inundated with the idea of it being the war of Northern aggression. Remember, Jefferson Davis immediately in 1865, when the war is over, begins to write these books, and a whole lot of Southerners start rewriting history from the beginning. So people going by what they are reading. They've been taught this, they've been indoctrinated into this idea that this was not about slavery, that it was, the noble cause of the South and the Northern Aggression War. This is the narrative that they've been told generationally. We're talking, 150 years of that. So it's generational, so they believe it. So when I've learned, and I'm sure you have in having religious discussions with people, when you say something about a sacred cow, something that is religiously held, like the idea of the self being, that's a religious idea now. It is not, it's beyond a social political idea. It's a religious belief. All right, with all the trappings of religion, you have the gods who are General Lee and Jefferson Davis and Stonewall Jackson. These are deities now. All right, so this is a mythology that people have bought into and accepted. That's why I call it a mythology. It is a myth that people have bought into and are committed to that idea. And when you come against that, when you come against a religious idea, you know how violent that can be. And let me be clear, not just religious ideas that include deity, religious ideas like the Soviet state, religious idea. Lenin and Stalin were gods to these people. Putin still has a poster of Stalin on his wall that he worships to every day, I'm quite sure. He loves Joseph Stalin, God to him. So religions don't have to have an actual supernatural deity. They can have deities, all the different types, social political deities.
I wonder if our current administration has that same poster. Listen, I think we might have hit our time here.
Okay, so let me be clear. I'm sorry I didn't go through complete history and bring us all the way up to the modern times. We'll have to talk about that again. Rick, thank you for keeping me on point as best you could.
Well, hey, but we covered a lot of great points,
and we found out that I like Raiden and Sub-Zero as well.
And so, I have them in the same order, so we're right there.
We're right there.
Must have some type of parallel being there. But listen,
we might have the same slave ancestors, not the free ones.
Right. We
got slavery. We got the same slave.
Well, listen, I can't thank you enough for allowing me to come on and host this evening with you, Richard. It's been an absolute honor and pleasure. Hats off to Ms. Cynthia McDonald and a speedy recovery for her. I'm looking forward to, if I need to be back next week, I'll be back next week, or if she'll be returning. But thank you again for having me. You all can check out our show, my show that I co-host with Ethan on Thursday nights at 7:30 on YFNA News, called In Black and White, where we have conversations about racism and racial injustice, so that we can start making some headway and changes in our communities. But thank you again for having me. Make sure that you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the little alarm button so that you can get alerted for when our shows go live. And as I say always, share this on your platform so that people can get involved in the conversation as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a good night.
You too.